We are now on the last session of today's webinar, which is with Peter Bruce, and it's my honor to be hosting the conversation with him. So for those of you who don't know, Peter Bruce is editor-in-chief of the Business Day and Financial Mail, or he was, should I say. He's now a Sunday Times columnist, which I read every Sunday. I look forward to going and reading his column in the newspaper. And he also used to be a reporter for the Financial Times. I think most importantly, however, he is an ardent Springbok and rugby supporter and Proteas cricketer. But sadly, I must say, Peter, I see you are a Shark supporter, so that I'm not that happy with. But anyway, I think in terms of the way we're going to handle today's interview is I've asked Peter to kick off for about 10 minutes or so, and I've asked him to give some comments on a few things which I thought were topical, which were the Zondo Commission, President Ramaphosa sitting in front of the Zondo Commission. We've also asked him to speak about things like the cadre deployment policy, fighting corruption, the cabinet reshuffle that President Ramaphosa did a couple of weeks ago. So he's going to start off by commenting on some of these topics as well as anything else for about 10 minutes or so, and then I will also take over and put a few questions to him for the final 15 or 20 minutes. So Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you here. And I'm going to hand over to you to just give your opening comments on some of these topics that I've just introduced.
Trevor, thank you very much. And I'm sorry about the Shark being a Shark supporter. It's I'm very pleased, although I live in the Western Cape, I'm very pleased I'm not a Storm supporter at the moment. Nonetheless, look, the Zondo Commission, I think, has done an amazing job. You know, if we didn't know what was going on before the Zondo Commission, it's given us great moments of insight and clarity into us as a society, really. And, you know, one wonders what is now going to happen. He has to produce a report, and quite quickly. And you wonder how the government will treat it, whether it will follow the advice that Zondo sets out and act against any of the people that find themselves incriminated. Zondo, of course, can only recommend, be he the Deputy Chief Justice at the moment, and possibly the next Chief Justice. And it's very hard to say how the government will do that, because obviously, you know, experience tells us that presidents, when they get these reports from the commissions that they establish, very often sit on them. Thabo Mbeki once asked Judge Sisi Kampempe to produce a report on an election in Zimbabwe, which he sat on for 20 years. You know, I doubt whether President Cyril Ramaphosa will sit on this one, but if his recommendations to him are uncomfortable, well, then he will, you know, until it becomes politically impossible. I didn't know really that Cyril did all that well at the commission. I think the fact that he was there was important. It was sort of optically important for us as a country. But it's, you know, whether he took responsibility or not is difficult to say. And whether that was his job or not was difficult to say. You know, it's much easier to say I'm responsible when you know that that's only half the truth, and that the fact is that the people who are really responsible are either in jail or in your cabinet or in parliament with you. I thought in general he did all right. And as I say, I think the optics were overwhelmingly positive, even if he wasn't overwhelmingly convincing. Cadre deployment, you know, people ask about cadre deployment a lot. And what we need to understand, because there was a point towards the end of his testimony to Zondo where it came up, and it was quite clear that Cyril didn't know that the commission had minutes of a cadre deployment committee meeting where the appointment of judges even came up, which is a shocking insight, I thought, into how deeply the party is involved in trying to control the outcome of events that it considers to be important. But we need to understand about cadet appointment is that it's an absolutely central tenet of ANC policy. It is one of the few core things that they hold dear. And it believes that it needs to be able to decide who the Chief Justice is and who these judges are and the magistrate and the mayors, et cetera, because it believes that it is the leader of society. And the only way to strip it of this delusion is to vote it not out of power, but certainly into coalitions. He talks about, Cyril talked a lot about getting rid of corruption, and one asks whether this is hot air or not. And I think he means it when he says that he wants to, but he means it entirely politically. He operates, what we need to understand about Cyril, he operates entirely politically, with his eye constantly on the balance of forces inside the ANC, not in society. It's what happens in the ANC that matters to him. So he's extremely, even absurdly cautious sometimes. But nonetheless, quite a lot of things have happened, and we know what they are at SARS, at the NPA. People have been stripped of power. Money is being recovered slowly, even in civil society, even in business. Some of the big consulting companies have repaid monies that they got from working with leaders of state capture. So, and just last week, some of the people who got outrageously appointed as parliamentary committee chairs after Cyril became president initially were stripped of those chairs. So it's very slow. There's a lot of stuff still to happen, but things are happening. For me, the key thing that needs to happen quickly, and one doesn't know whether it will, is that we need a functioning police force who can arrest people without looking over its shoulder, to see whether it's okay or not. And only the president can remove the national commissioner. The police minister can't. The police minister has asked the president to remove him. The president hasn't yet. And it's quite evident the police force is sort of incoherent, incompetent, largely. There's lots of good people in it, but very badly led. The cabinet reshuffle was a mixed bag, I thought. There were still a lot of sort of dodgy people left afterwards. But once again, you have to appreciate that it's an entirely political thing. He's not trying to satisfy you or me or anybody out there. He doesn't care about the voters. He's got the votes in the pocket. He worries about his party, So only in one instance can I see competency as an issue in that reshuffle, and that was in the removal of Stella Ndabeni-Abrams as Minister of Communications to small business, where the budget for small business is so small and its input into small business is pretty meaningless. And I think that was a competency thing. But it was a moment, it was very important moment and attempt by Cyril to regather his forces. And by his forces, you've got to look at what he faces ahead of him. So there's a local government election coming up. One doesn't know quite when that will happen. I don't know that the courts will allow a delay that the ANC wants. They might have a shorter one, maybe to November. He then has what they call a general council ANC, which he doesn't want to go through, but it's a policy conference that normally happens before an ANC general congress that elects a president. So there's a general congress happens at the end of next year. There's an ANC election. He will have to fight for his place. And then there's a general election in 18 months after that. And if he loses the ANC election at the end of next year, he'll be stripped of his presidency. And what the reshuffle is all about is shoring up his position in the NEC, the national executive of the ANC, so that enough people in there are happy that he's treating them fairly. All ANC presidents do the same. Jacob Zuma perfected it. He just packed the ANC. The ANC gets elected separately to the president of the party, and what Zuma did was just give them all jobs in his cabinet. So everybody in the NEC supported him, and Cyril is kind of playing the same kind of game. They've got to get a lot of ducks in a row. he just wants to win hearts in the NEC. It's the only calculation that he'll be making. Lindiwe Sisulu was given was dealt a pretty rough hand, I thought, and you know, she was moved from a very big department, housing and water, to tourism. And the word that I hear from people close to Lindiwe is that he called her 10 minutes before the announcement, that the president told her what he was going to do, and she refused, and he announced it anyway. So, you know, she was never an NEC vote that he could rely on. So it wouldn't matter really how badly she's been treated. But I did say to my friend who sometimes works for Lindiwe Sisulu that the best thing she can do now for herself and her political career, and maybe to, you know, build a battlefront against Cyril Ramaphosa, is to do her job properly.
Some great comments there. Just on one of your comments, and I think you even wrote about it a few weeks ago, perhaps in your column, you touched on it, is this fine line, I guess, between when you're president of the country and president of the ANC or any political party. When you are in power, when should you be doing perhaps what is right for the country and putting, let's call it, the country's objectives first, versus putting your own political party and politics first? And you've sort of made the comment now that President Ramaphosa is largely thinking of himself and politics and the ANC, and perhaps not doing the right decisions always for the greater country at good. Can you just comment perhaps on that?
Look, so what happens is that you know, in Ramaphosa's case, he believes that he's set in motion a series of reforms that are ongoing, independent of the politics. So he has Brian Patel at DTRC chasing a policy of localization, which is another issue entirely. He has various ministers doing things. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma is supposed to be producing what they call the district model, which is a centralizing of municipalities, small municipalities, into a bigger one. So there's, you know, where there are 20 small towns with water problems, there'll be one guy for all of them who can fix the water problem. So they're all doing what he thinks are reforms, and where you get caught out on that line, Trevor, is when the reforms that you are doing don't work properly. And so what Ramaphosa needs to look at, and what he doesn't look at often enough, is the unemployment number. And we know what happened when they came out last week. They're absolutely appalling. Never been worse. We're approaching, if you take the broad level of unemployment, 50% in this country, which is a recipe for disaster. So that will begin to affect both sides of the line that he tries to walk, because it affects his position politically in the party. People don't want to lose elections, you know, and you don't win elections with 44, 45% broad-based unemployment. Well, you can in this country, but, you know, our circumstances are different. And on the other side, structurally, you know, he's got to ask himself whether what he's asked Brian Patel or his other ministers to do is in fact the right thing. So it's a very fine line. There are different lines, you know, and Joe Biden has found out to his cost in the US, where he's done a sensible thing in a way by pulling out of Afghanistan, but it's drastically hurt the democratic chances on the political side of his line in the midterms and for the next presidential election. So look, it's a very fine line that all politicians walk. Fundamentally, they try to keep their parties happy before anybody else. They all do.
Agreed. Peter, changing topic a little bit, let's talk on COVID. It's been quite raised in all of the presentations that we've had from many of the fund managers as well, and of course will have a major impact on things like economic growth, well, globally and specifically in South Africa. You've been quite critical of the government and its policies of rolling out the vaccination. We know at one stage they got very close to 250,000 odd vaccinations a day, and it's fallen off. We've also seen a big rise in, let's call it the anti-vaccination movement, propaganda, whatever you want to call it. Would you like to just share your comments on perhaps the rollout, the government policy of it, and any suggestions of what you think they should be doing differently?
Well, I mean, it's such a critical question, Trevor. I think we vaccinated about 12% of the population, and we're going to get to, and we're now doing the sort of really young people. My son, who's in his 20s, got vaccinated for the first time yesterday. Our problem is that when they dry up, and let's say there are 2 million people to go. That's let's say we get to 20% of the population fully vaccinated. We need to recognize that we are vaccinating people who want to be vaccinated. So then you're stuck. You vaccinated all you can, and then you've got your problem of people who are just not pitching up. You've got empty vaccination stations, no queues. I don't know where, the Discovery vaccination centers have worked very well. I went to a place I would not normally go to. I went to Mitchell's Plain in Cape Town, to Lentigo Clinic, and it was just amazingly well done. I mean, it was just brilliant how organized everybody was. But sooner or later, that will all just stop, and we'll be at about 20% vaccinated. And that has two very, very frightening consequences for us as citizens, let alone the government politically. One, we remain very vulnerable then to new variants, and there's already a new variant, C.1.2, that is now beginning to show its face in South Africa, although the vaccines that we have will be will be effective against it. We open ourselves to more variants, and two, we remain a very dangerous country to visit. So our tourism is never able to recover. And countries like the UK will keep us on a red list forever until we've at least done 50% of the population. If it's 11 now, and people are, they've skimmed off the cream. That's all they've vaccinated are people who want it. Nobody has been persuaded, or very few. So there's a huge job still for them to do, a massive job. And once again, so those are the threats to us. Economically, no tourists is a massive problem for South Africa, let alone us being able to travel anywhere. And then they've got to find a way to convince people to take the vaccination. Now they could, once the vaccines are declared, ready for non-emergency use, as I think Pfizer and Moderna have in the US, the government can then say, look, you've got to have this vaccine, or you can't be allowed into a post office or a hospital or whatever it might be. And it might begin to have to get a bit rough with people in order to get to the kind of numbers that it needs to. And we as a society then have to decide for ourselves whether we support that kind of thing. It's very illiberal. But it might be necessary to say to people, look, fantastic and very interesting theory you have about vaccination and Bill Gates magnetizing you, whatever they might think it is, but it's just not good enough. You've got to get a vaccine, or you can't go to school, or you can't go into the post office, or you've got to wear a mask for the rest of your life, sort of thing. So it will definitely have political consequences, because the government is going to have to change. If we think the government has been a bit brutal now, it's going to have to get much worse to get from 20% to 50%, because those people don't want to get vaccinated. They're not going to go and queue up. They are going to resist, and we don't know, and the government doesn't know, I'm sure, how to deal with that. They'll go on about education. That's not going to work either. Some form of coercion is going to be required.
Thanks for that. And yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how they do that and roll it out. Peter, you touched on it also earlier, and I guess it's something we need to just comment on and chat about, are these municipal elections that are coming up. They were meant to be held in October. They are at the courts. Perhaps it's going to be delayed to February. We're still waiting to hear the final decision. We also see the ANC in putting up their candidates. It's been a little bit of a mess. You've written quite a lot about the opposition parties on this, though, and the opportunity or not that these elections could hold for them. And you've criticized perhaps some of the opposition parties for not putting enough pressure on the government. And more importantly, and I thought it was a great point, is that they haven't actually themselves come up with better ideas or better policies of how things could be done differently. And second question linked, I guess, to that would be, let's see what happens in these elections, but this whole idea of coalition politics and parties, we know that historically the DA and the EFF shacked up together a little bit. It's sort of come apart. Do you see perhaps potential for the ANC and the DA to get together at all in certain areas? If you could just comment really on opposition politics and the municipal elections.
Yeah, thank you. It's a fascinating moment, isn't it? I mean, I don't think the courts are going to go for the February option. I think that the ANC might win. I think there'll be a playoff where the election happens a little later than originally planned, say late November, and the ANC can and the parties can resubmit, because it's not the only one complaining about being, not having enough time or whatever. So I think we'll still have these local government elections this year. And it's very interesting what happens. It happens in provincial, happens mainly in national elections, and I'm not sure about the Cape in local elections, but I'm always told that the swing vote in the Western Cape, particularly because it's where the DA has control, the swing vote is the coloured voters. And it's putting it a bit crudely, and I don't mean to, but it's just for brevity, where in areas where there are not many Africans, coloured voters will vote for the ANC, and where there are many Africans, they'll vote for the DA. What you now have is the prospect of a rejuvenated and confident Freedom Front Plus challenging the DA in those areas which it would normally count on for coloured votes in the Cape. That's around Cape Town, Hermanus, wherever it might be, Overstrand. Simply because it can, the Freedom Front Plus can campaign in Afrikaans. They have a very strident program. It's not very subtle. John Steenhuisen and the DA, on the other hand, as you say, are under pressure to produce not more of the same. They cannot win elections by complaining about ANC corruption. They must know this by now. They've scored fantastic victories. They've done us all a lot of good. But you've got to come up. You've got to win the main argument, and the main argument is the economy. Stupid. Who was it who put that sign on Bill Clinton's desk? And so you've got to come up with better ideas than the ANC has. And we need our politics to elevate itself to the point where we are fighting for ideas. A lot of the world is corrupt, Trevor. It doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. But there's corruption everywhere. There's corruption in Asia, there's corruption in Australia, there's corruption in Europe, and these countries thrive despite it. Corruption is not the cause of the state of the country. The cause of the state of the country is poor economic policy, and it gets repeated and repeated and repeated, and nobody challenges it. The DA hasn't had a leader yet, and John Steenhuisen may be the first who stands up and talks about economic policy before anything else. It is not central to what they are or what they think they are. And that's a grave, grave error. And it will be to their eternal cost if they don't pick it up soon and run with an economic argument against the way the ANC is implementing policy. There are other ways to get this country back to work than what the ANC is proposing. And they need to be on the table for voters to judge by. And they're not, because nobody puts them there.
Yep, I think that's a great point and totally agree. So I guess, as you're saying, the opportunity is there for opposition parties and politics, and who grabs it the best, perhaps. So, Peter, looking forward, and I suppose we need to look at the ANC specifically as they are in power. Where is the next generation of leaders? And perhaps it's not only for the ANC we're talking about across the political landscape. We see largely within the ANC, it's still very much the old leaders that have been there for a long time. Do you see a next generation of leaders who are of good quality, good caliber across the political spectrum?
Well, unfortunately, all of our political parties, including the DA, are very, very hierarchical. For instance, let's carry on just talking about the DA so we're not blaming the ANC for everything. I mean, the DA, if you're a DA MP, you're not allowed to speak in public other than the issue to which you are assigned. Nobody could come out just out of the blue to a reporter in the DA and talk about economic policy if they weren't the shadow minister for trade and industry or finance or whatever it might be. And so we don't get many chances to see bright young people coming through. Having said that, we know that they're there because we meet them informally and at seminars like, companies like Nedbank and the Net Group, broader group can have. And there is enormous talent around. As for the ANC, you have to look at younger people, but they're already there, probably like sort of Paul Mashatile. I reckon Cyril probably gets a second term. But come the next term, which would be 26 or 27, the Paul Mashatiles will be ready for rule. And they're very savvy. They understand business. They understand wealth creation much better than the current group of ministers do. They may or may not be corrupt. It almost doesn't matter as long as they leave you alone to do what you do best. It's hard to come up with names. If you look once again at the ANC, I've been very impressed with the Justice Minister, Ronald Lamola. I don't know whether you've heard him speak, but very thoughtful, very deliberate, very careful guy, clearly meant for bigger things in the ANC, but has tied himself pretty close to Cyril Ramaphosa. And I don't know. Part of the problem is, you get if people think that you're in a camp, once your leader goes, you go too, and you're out. So it's very difficult to put to write down names and say, look, these are going to be the leaders of the future, because you've got to belong to at the moment, the way the ANC works, you've got to belong to a faction, at the moment also in the ANC, the factions have fragmented into, there was a Zuma faction, now there's a lot of it. Paul Mashatile will have his own, I suppose. But yeah, look, I mean, there are people out there, and I wouldn't be nervous about the political future, partly because we've spent and business has spent an enormous amount of money on exposing young people to the economy and to other ways of thinking. People have been sent to decent universities overseas and been exposed to other thought. So I think that we are better placed in the future than we are in the sort of short term.
That's great.
I don't know if that
Great.
helps.
Yeah, no, great to hear. Peter, we are drawing to an end. We've got 3 or 4 more minutes, and then I'm going to end our conversation. It's been fascinating. So last question, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot. Clem Santa used to speak about, the high road and the low road. We can debate which road the last 10 years South Africa's been on, but certainly, ideally, we want to get South Africa firmly back onto the high road. If I had gave you a magic wand and granted you, let's say, 3 wishes, what 3 wishes would you implement pretty much immediately in South Africa to help us and ensure us to be on that high road?
And this is apart from making me a special advisor to Rassie Erasmus and the Springbok selectors. Gosh, okay. I'd introduce a massive tax cut, get the marginal rate down to around 30%, get people, you want money in people's pockets for them to spend the way they want it rather than for the government to misspend it. I'd raise the VAT threshold from 1 million rand to 5 million. So you encourage people to get out and start companies. You hit this wall at 1 million rand if you've started your own little business, where your tax rate suddenly goes from 28% to 45%, and there's no point to it. It's a disincentive to create businesses. And clearly, what you want in South Africa, if you want to create jobs, you've got to create employers first. So you absolutely need as many incentives built into the tax system as possible. I'd also, in that same vein, this is number 3, I'd institute an immigration program to attract 1 million skilled people into the country, with the promise that they can stay if after 3 years they've created 5 sustainable jobs. And people will say, well, nobody wants to come and live here, and I promise you they do. We're a much nicer place to live in than a lot of elsewhere in the world, and there is a lot of skill out there. And the way you learn, Trevor, you don't even need an education, really. To get a skill, you need to watch somebody who already knows what they're doing and copy them and have them, and you watch them doing what they do for 5 years, and then they're going to watch you do it for the next 5 years. And by the time that's over, you're skilled and you can do the most complex things imaginable. And that's why we want skilled immigrants here. We've lost almost 1 million skills in South Africa. They've emigrated. We need to replace them. We can't do it ourselves. You cannot learn skills in a book or from a university. And I know you're in a hurry. I would change the constitution to cut the president's powers. He's got way too many powers. The fact that the president is the only person who can hire or fire the National Commissioner of Police is just crazy. I would take a lot of those kind of, and Dikgang Moseneke wrote a wonderful paper saying exactly the same thing, and he listed the president's powers. They're enormous. And of course, Cyril wrote the constitution, so he knows exactly what they are. But he needs, that power is too much. It's too much for him. It's too much for anybody to bear. And they need to be devolved to Parliament. Or in that one, you could also deal with that by changing our electoral system, where we elect a Parliament and president separately but directly. So they become different elections. Although they could happen at the same time. I'd allow a 3-month entry visa. I'd allow 3 months visa-free entry into South Africa for anybody who arrives here on an aeroplane. The Thais do this brilliantly. You know, if you go to Bangkok, you go through immigration. They give you a piece of paper that you slip into your passport. And you know, if you are found with, if you try and get out of Thailand, and you're over the date of the piece of paper stamped on your paper, you're in trouble. But we should do as much as possible to get tourists back to South Africa, and that goes through vaccination as well. But the immigration system, the hoops you've got to get in here are just crazy. And the last thing I'd do is I'd make driving licenses valid for 20 years and take the pressure off us all.
Yes. It's interesting. Your last one, that was being debated on the radio yesterday, and the exact guys that were knowledgeable in this area put the same proposal. So they were actually they proposed 10 years, not 20 years, but the theory was the same.
Yeah, I don't think it matters. I don't think any country. I certainly, I used to have a British driver's ever test for it again. It's just yours until somebody tells you you can't drive because you've driven into a lamppost or something, at 9 o'clock in the morning and you're 90 years old.
Correct. So they were debating, you need to go and have, your eyes tested as well. So both of us are Seaway glasses. Peter,
Yes.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting, fascinating. We could carry on, but time flies when you're having fun. I really thank you so much for your time, for dialing in, and your interesting insights. Much appreciated. And to everybody on the webinar, that really brings us to an end of the Nedgroup Investments Multi-Manager webinar, which we've had today and yesterday. We had over 500 or so people yesterday and today on the call, which is amazing. We hope that you really found it interesting across all areas: domestic markets, offshore, politics, economics, sustainability, etc. And we look forward to welcoming you all back towards the end of the year when we have our final multi-manager webinar. So everybody, stay safe, stay healthy, and thanks again for dialing in.